Welcome, everyone, to the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. My name is Eddie Portnoy, and I'm the Senior Academic Advisor and Director of Exhibitions here at YIVO. Today, we have Mark Kaplan joining us to give a lecture entitled The Reality of Myth for Yiddish Writers in Weimar, Germany. For those of you who are unfamiliar with YIVO, we are a unique institution for the celebration, contemplation, and exploration of Yiddish language and Eastern European Jewish culture. We are located in New York City, where our library and archives contain over 24 million documents and approximately 300,000 books. Scholars from around the world come to YIVO to engage in research using these resources. In addition to this, we offer many classes on Yiddish language and culture, exhibitions, and public programs like this one, where we aim to bridge the worlds of Jewish culture and our vast library and archival collections. This particular event is part of Carnegie Hall's Fall of the Weimar Republic, Dancing on the Precipice Festival. YIVO will have two more programs as part of this festival, one in March and another in May, so stay tuned for those. Now, we're very excited to have all of you joining us for today's lecture. Mark Kaplan is a native of Louisiana and graduate of Yale University. In 2003, he earned his PhD in comparative literature from New York University. Since then, he has held professorial appointments at Indiana University, Johns Hopkins University, Yale, and the University of Wrocław, and Dartmouth College as well as research fellowships at the University of Pennsylvania, Harvard University, and the Universitat Konstanz, as well as the Center for Jewish History, the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. In 2011, he published How Strange the Change, Language, Temporality, and Narrative Form in Peripheral Modernisms, a comparison of Yiddish and African literatures with Stanford University Press. His second book, Yiddish Writers in Weimar, Berlin, A Fugitive Modernism, was published by Indiana University Press in 2021. Currently, he is a senior lecturer in Yiddish literature for the Heinrich Heine University in Dusseldorf, Germany. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mark Kaplan.
Thank you very much. I must begin my remarks today by thanking my parents. All those years of violin lessons have finally paid off, because today I'm not only lecturing at YIVO, I'm also playing Carnegie Hall. But more logistically, I'd like to add my thanks to my friends Julia Rothkopf and Alex Weiser and Eddie Portnoy at the YIVO Institute for inviting me to present some of my book on the aesthetics of Yiddish literature in interwar Berlin as part of this program. And most of all, I want to thank everyone who is tuning in, with hopes that following my prepared remarks will transform this event from a formal lecture into a conversation, because talking about this period is pretty much my favorite thing to do, and talking about almost anything is my favorite way to learn. The topic of Weimar Germany, in any number of contexts and for countless reasons, is disconcertingly relevant to the present situation, wherever we find ourselves. It is far more resonant to the preoccupations of 2024 than it was when I began researching my book more than 10 years ago, and I'll return to some of those resonances at the end of my prepared remarks. But instead of offering an amateur historical opinion about why I think this period exerts such a hold on us today, I want to consider the formal aesthetic features of the Weimar era, reflected through the Yiddish writers who tentatively and temporarily made Berlin their home about a century ago, to understand what commonalities might exist between Weimar and today, and what uses these writers made of a Weimar aesthetic to represent their own place or placelessness in that cultural and historical moment. The aesthetics of the Weimar period, whether we consider the screaming hothouse emotionalism of the Expressionists or the newer, specifically German ideals of new objectivity, which created cool surfaces and crisp designs, glass and steel replacing flesh and blood, are in opposing but complementary ways the aesthetics of trauma and dislocation. The Yiddish writers who came to Berlin both magnified the dislocations of German society at the time and add to it their own aesthetic responses to trauma. These Yiddish writers use the fragments of past experience to create a new myth that renegotiates their relationship to their East European origins. Before considering the complexity of these writers' relationship to Eastern Europe and Germany, a few historical characteristics of their new environment are worth noting. First, Berlin does not rank with cities such as Warsaw, Odessa, Vilna, or New York in the first rank of metropolises where a modern Yiddish culture took shape. The era in which Berlin was home to significant numbers of Yiddish writers, really only the 1920s, was too brief. The material circumstances for producing and publishing Yiddish literature were too precarious, and the larger Jewish community there was too deeply assimilated to the German language for Berlin to count as a center for Yiddish culture. Nonetheless, as a way station or city of refuge, Berlin offers a rich historical contribution to Yiddish culture and a provocative literature that sets an enduring standard for the Yiddish literary avant-garde. By way of illustration, the leading light of Berlin's Yiddish literati, David Bergelson, on whom my remarks today will focus, reportedly duetted on violin one evening at the Sholem Aleichem Club, a private club for East European Jewish expatriates in Berlin, with the physicist Albert Einstein. Although their concert was a singular event, it indicates that these Yiddish-speaking refugees were on occasion able to participate in the life of the city to a remarkable degree. If one cannot, therefore, consider Berlin to be a center of Yiddish creativity, it was during the era of the Weimar Republic nonetheless an innovative and noteworthy crossroads. David Bergelson, in fact, illustrates the marginality of Berlin in the most important essay of his career, Three Centers, written in 1926, which he wrote in Berlin for publication in the journal In Harness, published in then Polish Vilna. As he recounts in the essay, there were three places at that time where Yiddish could be said to have a presence and, perhaps, a future: Poland, the United States, specifically New York, and the Soviet Union. In Bergelson's opinion, Poland had a large, educated Yiddish-speaking population, but few resources for Yiddish literature and no vehicle for publishing serious writing. Never mind that the essay itself was published there. The United States had comparatively greater financial resources, and Bergelson's primary source of income as a writer came through the Yiddish press based in New York. But Yiddish writers there had to confront the reality of a dwindling readership, little interest in Yiddish education, and no interest in developing a sophisticated literary culture. Only the Soviet Union, for Bergelson, combined a large, politically engaged Yiddish readership interested in modern literature with the institutional support necessary to develop and sustain a literary culture. Although the essay's orientation toward Yiddish culture in the Soviet Union signifies a larger tendency among Yiddish cultural figures in Berlin, what is most remarkable about Bergelson's argument is the fact that Berlin itself figures nowhere in his essay. There were other factors, however, that account for Berlin's appeal to so many Yiddish activists, along with other Jewish and non-Jewish refugees from the former Russian Empire in the first years of the Weimar Republic. Perhaps the most compelling, particularly in the years of German hyperinflation until the end of 1923, were economic. Given the low valuation of the German mark, anyone with foreign currency could take advantage of the exchange rate to subsist in Germany, and anyone with American dollars could live comfortably. The Yiddish journalist David Einhorn, for example, wrote in the American Yiddish newspaper Der Vorwärts, The Forward, in January 1923 that a new suit in Berlin at the time cost $9. A new shirt, in his estimate, cost only 50 cents. Other factors also made Berlin an attractive destination, at least during the 1920s. Paramount among these was the precariousness of life in the new Soviet Union. Yiddish writers based in Kyiv, in particular, lived in an environment of pogroms, privation, and political instability. They fled to Berlin as refugees, not as tourists or economic speculators. Though not as close geographically as Poland, Germany held economic and diplomatic relations with the new regime at a time when Poland had outlawed the Communist Party and maintained a militarized border with the Soviet Union. The German language was also closer to Yiddish than Polish for Jews who had come of age in Russian-speaking regions, and German culture was the ideal, as well as the means by which Eastern European Jews had westernized in preceding generations. And Berlin provided perhaps the only space in the Yiddish world where ideological differences among Zionists, socialists, communists, among others, did not prevent cultural and social collaboration. One outstanding example of this cross-ideological collaboration was the bilingual journal Milgräum Rimon. The title means pomegranate in Yiddish and Hebrew respectively, which published in Yiddish and Hebrew between 1922 and 1924. A journal dedicated to visual art and literature, it represents the pinnacle of what the avant-garde produced in Jewish languages at that time. The fact that only 6 issues of the journal were published, however, indicates the limitations imposed both economically and ideologically on a journal dedicated to art for art's sake. Because the economic circumstances in the early years of the Weimar Republic were so conducive to residents with connections to foreign currency, and so catastrophic for people without them, Berlin served as an important address for a variety of Jewish publishing ventures in Hebrew and Russian as well as Yiddish. In part because currency reforms stabilized the German economy from 1924 until the Great Depression, few of these publishing initiatives enjoyed large print runs, and because there were proportionately few readers of Jewish languages in Germany, there was very little local interest in Yiddish or Hebrew literature in the original. When Yiddish writers or their Hebrew counterparts wrote or published in Berlin, they did so largely for export to larger communities either to the east or in Palestine. The most lucrative literary work for Yiddish writers in Berlin was to write for the American Yiddish Press, which maintained European bureaus in Berlin because of its central location geographically, as well as the comparatively inexpensive cost of doing business there. The New York-based Vorwärts newspaper, the largest Yiddish language daily in history, was a particularly sought-after venue, attracting rival German-speaking socialists such as Eduard Bernstein and Karl Kautsky, whose polemics were translated specially for the paper, paying at the time $25 per article, which, adjusted for inflation, would be more than $400 in contemporary terms, far more than the Vorwärts website pays contributors today. Don't ask me how I know. David Bergelson, the author on whom I wish to focus the remainder of my remarks, illustrates some of the paradoxes of Yiddish writers living in Berlin. Though supportive of the Ukrainian Socialist Republic that existed between the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution and its incorporation into the USSR in 1922, he traveled to Berlin on a Lithuanian passport in 1921 and remained in Germany until 1933, longer than nearly all of his peers in the Yiddish world. He also spent an additional year in Denmark before settling in the Soviet Union. Although he began writing for the anti-Soviet Vorwärts newspaper, he switched allegiances in 1926 and began writing for the New York communist newspaper, Die Freiheit. Despite this ideological shift, which might have been provoked as much by the abusive behavior of the Vorwärts authoritarian editor Abe Kahn as newfound loyalty to the Soviet Union, Bergelson's writing actually changes little to signal these new allegiances. As I've said, Bergelson's time in Berlin was longer than any other Yiddish writer of his stature, and he was at the heart of a lively Yiddish expatriate culture there throughout. Yet the fiction he produced directly engaging this experience, only 8 short stories, collected in a translated edition of little more than 100 pages, provides little description of this milieu. Although the motivation for these omissions is a subject which I will consider, what Bergelson's Berlin fiction does include is important. As I wish to suggest with the title of my lecture, Berlin exerts for the writers whom I consider as much as for us as inheritors of the Weimar Republic's intellectual and aesthetic legacy, a mythical appeal. But in technical terms, when a myth derives from history rather than cosmology, from real people rather than deities, we cease calling it myth and consider it instead allegory. And the interpretations I offer of Bergelson's Berlin fiction are intended to demonstrate how they render Berlin an allegorical space for his fiction, and how the Weimar Republic functions as an allegorical space for our own relationship to a still recent, thoroughly historical past. I want to turn my attention now to the best and most representative story that Bergelson set in Berlin, Zwischen Immigranten, Among Refugees, written in 1923, which takes as its setting the boarding house to illustrate the fundamental transience and spectacle of Yiddish Berlin. For Bergelson, the boarding house functions as the representative location for the Berlin experience, not only because of the ethnographic reason that many Jews and other refugees resided in these dwellings, but also because the boarding house stands halfway between older communal hostels and the modern autonomous anonymous apartment building. Moreover, as a literary genre, the boarding house narrative was a favored premise for other expatriate writers of his generation, most notably Shai Agnon in Hebrew, Christopher Isherwood in English, and Vladimir Nabokov in Russian. Among Refugees begins with the arrival of its unnamed protagonist at the home of the narrator, a correspondingly unnamed but apparently successful Yiddish writer. From the first, the protagonist calls to mind gray dust on the roads of small towns, and he gave the impression of someone who had breathlessly traveled a long distance. The protagonist embodies not only the shtetl, the dust of small towns, but also the dislocation between shtetl and city. He is breathless because he is neither in Berlin nor in the Pale of Settlement, but constantly in transit, in conspicuous contrast with the narrator's settled life in a home with his family in Berlin. Physically, the protagonist's face is described as a kind of map, made up of two warring sides traversed by a mustache like a bridge. His face, at war with itself and with the world, is a contested landscape, so that the protagonist is at once a refugee from a civil war, but also an internalized embodiment of the war itself. Before the upheavals of war and pogrom that brought him to Berlin by way of Palestine, the protagonist was an orphan, living with his grandfather in the shtetl. Just as the protagonist's face resembles a map, his grandfather's face is like a clock. And this correspondence underscores how the grandfather's relationship with the protagonist figures the temporal suspension of the narrative, just as the protagonist's face signifies the spatial dislocation of the refugee. For both characters, the pogroms of civil war have interrupted the natural order of successive generations, so that time itself, represented by the clocks in the grandfather's house, becomes a grave, a memorial candle. In light of these disruptions, both the grandfather and the protagonist occupy a metaphorical space removed from everyday life, which for the protagonist occurs across the street in the affluent home of the Pinsky family. This dwelling stands as a mirror, an inversion of the protagonist's home, representing abundance, sexuality, and femininity, as opposed to death, sterility, and the neutered masculinity of an impotent grandfather and a sexually immature grandson. For the protagonist, the Pinskys perform everyday life, riding bicycles, playing piano, and hosting parties. The protagonist projects every feature of an ordinary existence onto the Pinskys, while his own life remains purely imaginary. These tendencies had already been trademarks of Bergelson's earlier fiction, but here, crucially, they are played against historical events of dramatic political urgency. The political implications of the protagonist's predicament enter the story with his arrival in Berlin, when he ostensibly recognizes a man responsible for the pogroms that drove him from his hometown, and who supposedly had violated the Pinsky daughter for whom the protagonist had pined. Bergelson writes, and I quote, "Listen, for nearly 3 weeks now, I've been living with him here in a squalid rooming house. I in room number 3, he in room 5, our doors facing one another," end quote. As with the Pinsky household, the protagonist in Berlin creates a spatial relationship in which his existence becomes projected onto the dwelling opposite him, and the substitution of his murderous designs on the pogromist for the erotic aspirations toward the Pinsky daughter serve to underscore the illusory, fantastic nature of both desires. Quote, "I can still feel his glare right here and here." The young man quickly smacked both his cheeks. "I wonder what the pogromist saw in me, a sordid young Jew," end quote. As is apparent, this is how the protagonist sees himself. So his neighbor, who may or may not be the pogromist he's accused of being, becomes not just the object of the pogromist's fantasies, but also the instrument of his own self-abnegation. That the neighbor might not be the actual pogromist in question can perhaps be deduced from the hyperbolic way the protagonist describes him. Bergelson thus writes, quote, "I've known him since my childhood, from every Jewish trouble. You think he's like Puriskevich, who founded the Tsarist Black Hundred? You think he's like Khrushchev, the chief instigator of the Kishinev pogrom? He's a lot worse," end quote. At once, this remark reflects the historical truth that the pogroms of the Ukrainian Civil War far exceeded previous anti-Semitic violence in Tsarist Russia, but it also makes of the pogromist a cosmic force responsible for the protagonist's condition, divesting the protagonist of personal agency in precise proportion to the degree that the protagonist projects his self-destructive violence onto him. The pogromist, if that's what we choose to call him, becomes an allegorical figure for the Berlin experience as Bergelson describes it. Ultimately, the nature of these fantasies blurs the distinction between erotic desire and a desire for destruction, so that the protagonist actually pines for the physical presence of the man he would ostensibly wish to destroy. Quote, "It was good to know that he was there in that room across from me, behind door number 5. And I always felt desolate whenever he went off somewhere and his room remained empty. The hours would stretch and stretch, and the minutes too," end quote. Here at last, the generic dictates of the boarding house narrative, which deals characteristically with the interrupted, fleeting, frustrated attraction of two boarders at the rooming house, take over so that the two desires for love and death are superimposed on one another via the collapse of distance separating the Pale of Settlement from Berlin. The intersection of eroticized longing and political hatred creates a Liebestod for the protagonist. Similarly, the blurring of erotic and destructive fantasies serves to disrupt the distinction between subject and object, or between the human and the inanimate. As the protagonist relates, quote, "Our two doors glared at each other harshly. I tell you, the only doors that can glare at each other like that are the doors in a rooming house where that thing has to happen. Door number 3 glared at door number 5 and appeared to be saying, 'My man who lives behind me is going to kill your man who lives behind you,'" close quote. Bergelson here draws on a technique already familiar from his earlier writing, of personifying inanimate objects, which in these earlier stories illustrate the fundamental proximity or similarity between the living and the inert, to suggest that insofar as immobile objects can behave like people, people, conversely, can be seen as immobile objects. Here, however, this technique is coupled with a dramatic and political significance that Bergelsen had previously minimized, so that the effect is both a psychological indication of the protagonist's mental instability and a narrative enactment of the surreal instability and unpredictability of life in a foreign metropolis. The protagonist's longing, simultaneous for the neighbor's presence as well as his destruction, raises the inevitable implication of a poorly repressed homosexual desire on the part of the protagonist. This dimension, novel nearly to the point of uniqueness in modern Yiddish literature, can be connected to the protagonist's paranoid suspicion of his neighbor's supposedly murderous past via then current theories regarding the relationship of paranoid psychosis with repressed homosexuality. This perspective, which, however dated in the present moment, was nonetheless part of a vanguard of ideas circulating in Berlin during the 1920s, suggests that the protagonist's previous desire for the Pinsky daughter consists not of a wish for possession or relationship, but identification. Of issue in the fictional case history Bergelsen creates is not just the instability of his subject's desire, but of the character's ego construction as such. What remains of this provisional discussion is a sense of where Bergelsen himself stands in relationship to Berlin and what role his writing plays for Yiddish literature. Having already designated Berlin inversely at the margins of his three centers for Yiddish culture, in Among Refugees, Bergelsen's disturbed protagonist appeals to the narrator because the narrator is a writer. Quote, people read a writer's works because they want to learn how his nation lived in his time, close quote. The protagonist invokes the national mission of the writer to underscore the absence of nationhood for Jewish refugees. Unlike the status of Jews in America, Poland, Russia, or the strategically omitted possibility of Mandate Palestine. In Bergelsen's account, East European Jews of Berlin live as fugitives. Berlin doesn't function for them as a location, only a dislocation. This interpretation of Berlin as a city without community captures for Bergelsen both an aesthetic and an ideological crisis that would eventually send him back to the Soviet Union. His Berlin stories are significant in the larger context of his writing because they constitute experiments in creating a narrative practice emancipated from his previous aesthetic of impressionism and stasis, but also independent from dominant aesthetic trends such as expressionism, new objectivity, or avant-garde Marxism. In Among Refugees, the failure of the writer to represent the refugees provides a further instance of how the narrator serves as an inversion for the protagonist. Having set up the spatial dimension of his predicament at the boarding house, the protagonist describes his journey from the Pale of Settlement to Palestine to Berlin, where he intends to write. In this respect, he takes over the narrator's role within the story and disrupts the narrator's position in equal measure to his own. Quote, I thought up a story, not about me, but about someone else. The story begins by describing a certain Jewish pauper in our town. The pauper is greatly despised by the Christian children there. The moment they spot him, they pelt him with rocks and sick their dogs on him. When the pauper arrives in the Christian neighborhood, he halts in the middle of the street and starts to cough so that the children will see him and sick their dogs on him, close quote. This narration is simultaneously a gesture of creation and erasure. The story apparently only exists in this spoken monologue. The protagonist states that the character he describes is not me, But the allegorical interpretation he adds to it undermines this declaration by stating, the Christian neighborhood, that was my town in disguise. My cough, that's my military service, my going to war, my leaving for Palestine as a common laborer. The act of spite that I've wanted to commit ever since my childhood, that's my way of begging for alms, close quote. The story, like its creator, negates its own existence even in the telling of it. The destabilized, triangulated oppositions on which among refugees is structured, among Berlin, the Pale of Settlement, and Palestine, the narrator, the protagonist, and the pogromist, the protagonist, the Pinsky daughter, and the pogromist, truth, falsehood, and fantasy serve to destabilize the narrative by keeping structural contrasts always in a state of flux. At the end of these contrasts, the narrator and the protagonist remain poised between the choices represented by the pen and the gun, word and deed, art and life, figured allegorically as death. But these oppositions dissolve rather than resolve when the protagonist sends the narrator a letter announcing his intention to kill himself rather than his neighbor. The act of suicide differentiates the protagonist from the narrator in the story, but it also suggests their ultimately interchangeable impotence. The protagonist turns to the narrator because, as a writer, he carries an ostensible responsibility to his people. The narrator's inability or refusal to supply the gun, his passivity in the face of a demand for action, signifies the abdication of this national role, as well as the ineffectuality of mere words to affect history. Drastic actions, decisions that only decades later would prove calamitous, were called for in the historical moment that Bergson confronted. And this provided the motivation for him to abandon Germany, but only after it had ceased to be the Weimar Republic and return to the Soviet Union. What follows for Germany after January 30th, 1933, is probably familiar to most everyone who is tuning in today. What follows for Bergson is perhaps less catastrophic, but no more consoling. And it calls to mind Orson Welles' remark that no story has a happy ending unless you leave off telling it before the end. When Bergson returned to the Soviet Union in 1934, he encountered, by all available evidence, a state and society finally willing to invest in and support Yiddish as a national language for the Jewish people. There was an extensive school system in Yiddish, operating all the way to the university and professional levels, along with Yiddish newspapers and journals, Yiddish theater and cinema, and the beginnings of a Yiddish-speaking autonomous region, Birobidzhan, at Russia's border with China. By the end of the 1930s, however, most of this was gone. The school systems were dismantled. Many leading authors and critics, including some of Bergson's most virulent Soviet detractors, were murdered in the purges, and the dream of an autonomous space in Birobidzhan veered closer to a nightmare. Although Bergson and other Yiddish writers were recruited into the Soviet war effort after 1941, their conspicuousness among Soviet Jews, as well as the foreign contacts they made among Yiddish speakers outside the Soviet world, marked them all as targets for persecution, incarceration, and torture later in the 1940s. Bergson, along with more than a dozen of his colleagues, was executed in Moscow on August 12, 1952, coincidentally his 68th birthday. The fate that befell Bergson at Stalin's behest after the war is ultimately similar to the desperation, abuse, and despair to which many German Jewish refugees fell victim during the 1930s and 1940s. This, too, is an inextricable part of the Weimar legacy. I don't, therefore, wish to romanticize the lives of these figures or the times in which they lived, however prone they were to romanticizing themselves. Rather, the displacement each suffered and the tragedy that befell so many of them serves as a moral obligation to each citizen in every nation to provide a home to the homeless, a refuge to the refugee, not because nature recognizes some people as natives and others as transients, but because the lesson of history, particularly this history, calls continuously to mind the fact that on a planet eternally in motion, all homes are forever fleeting. The authors and artists of the Weimar Republic attest to the historical complexity, social significance, and formal brilliance of interwar culture. By understanding the philosophical and historical motivations for their aesthetic choices, their works can be understood in ethical terms as well as aesthetic ones. I hope I've been able to illustrate just a little of this aesthetic complexity and ethical promise in the close reading I've offered today. I hope as well that I've been able to invest some of my remarks with a contemporary urgency that goes beyond literary analysis. Although I could not know it when I began researching my book, the world today faces some of the same threats that destroyed the Weimar Republic, and it is worth identifying some of the places where this is occurring. Russia, on a massive scale, and Hungary on a smaller one, are being drawn into a widening gyre of authoritarianism, intolerance, and corruption. Europe generally seems in perennial danger of dissolving into ever more fractious xenophobic nation states. And paradoxically, the more localized nationalist movements in places such as Spain or the United Kingdom possess a potential for more durable democratic models than the federated yet increasingly isolationist nation states from which they would secede. Israel, much like Turkey or India, has veered in the direction of an authoritarian, anti-democratic religious chauvinism that stands in shocking contrast to the ideals on which it was founded. The stakes of the next election in the United States need no additional elaboration from me. In the face of all these hazards, including the risks posed by acquiescence, passivity, fatalism, or despair, the culture of Weimar Germany offers a cautionary lesson against all of these, and several individual models for the pursuit of freedom, the dignity of the individual, and the value of community. Let us all honor these values in the culture we foster, the choices we make, and the hand we extend to every stranger we meet. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. That was fascinating. And, the note upon which you ended was obviously, relevant to the current situations in the world, which is indeed troubling. Now, if anyone has any questions for Dr. Kaplan, please leave them in the Q&A section of the Zoom. We'll welcome your questions and read them out. I just wanted to mention that as the way you began with the importance of Berlin, or the importance of this moment in Berlin during the 1920s, during the Weimar Republic, for Yiddish and the what was produced there in Yiddish is also relevant to the YIVO, because in fall of 1924, Nochem Stiff wrote a memorandum entitled, I believe, Wegna an akademischen, a Yiddischen Akademischen Institut, on a Yiddish academic institute, which was the impetus for the creation of YIVO. So, of course, Berlin played a role in the history of YIVO.
I think it's noteworthy. I mean, this is really, really important. I think it's noteworthy to remark on what happens next. YIVO gets started. The idea for YIVO is planted in Berlin. YIVO goes to Vilna. Nochem Stiff goes to the Soviet Union. So these are, again, reflected in the topic of Begelson's essay. What are the centers for Yiddish culture? They're not Berlin. Even for people who are in Berlin, Berlin is not the center. And the two choices between Vilna and the Soviet Union, well, nobody knew in 1924 or 1925, but those really weren't such great choices.
Right, that's true. That's true. And in fact, I mean, I could just point out from my own personal research, there's an a letter, I believe, in Zuni Maud's archive at Evo from Bergelson. Uh, Zuni Maud and Yossel Cutler, who were on tour in 1929, stopped in Berlin and spent time with Bergelson. And in Bergelson's letter to Zuni Maud, which I believe is from a year later, he talks about wanting to go back to New York. And so, that's clearly a center. He's a Yiddish writer. He needs to be, or he probably would prefer to be in a center that is, financially secure, culturally, somewhat more active. And, it's clear that we know what happened. I don't think he was able to get to New York. I don't think he had a sponsor, and the doors were already closed.
He did visit New York, I believe, in 1930, and that was maybe the occasion for the letter. Hey guys, I'm
Possibly,
going
yeah.
to be in town. Let's get together again. First of all, one of the things that's remarkable about Berlin is everybody passes through and everybody knows everybody, and it really had the makings of a community. But what frustrates you in reading this history, the makings of a community are there, but a community is not. Now, Bergelson does visit New York in 1930. According to Abe Kahn, Bergelson begged him for his job back. Now, this is Abe Kahn's telling, and I don't think that Kahn is a completely reliable narrator here, but it's clear that Bergelson wanted to be in New York, even though he had already said there's no future for Yiddish in New York. The future for Yiddish is in the Soviet Union. So it's characteristic of his ambivalence, and this is an ambivalence that he invests in pretty much everything that he ever writes. That having said, well, the future's in the Soviet Union, nonetheless, but maybe New York isn't so bad either. And he winds up spending another 3 years in Berlin instead.
Interesting. We do have one question, and if anyone does have questions, please put them in the Q&A section.
There might also be questions in the chat.
There are. That's what I'm seeing, actually. I see a question from Rabbi Jack Schlach there. Would you please share a few words about Joseph Roth's connection to this community?
Yeah. I share quite a few words about Joseph Roth in my in my book, but very briefly, Joseph Roth was probably the most prominent German language journalist based in Berlin during the 1920s. An interesting thing happens to his writing after the 1920s. By 1930, he starts to write about Eastern Europe, and he starts to write about the Jewish world. Roth definitely knew Yiddish. He could read in Yiddish. He could converse. It was probably a very Germanized, a very Deutschmanisch Yiddish, but he knew Yiddish, and he brings a kind of cultural credibility to his descriptions of Jewish life in Eastern Europe that other German language writers of that time don't possess. Everything that I'm talking about the way in which interwar writers create an allegory from their recent past is exemplified in Roth's writing. So reading Roth juxtaposed with Bergelson or the other Yiddish writers that I talk about is a very useful exercise. And it's an exercise that I'd like to give my own students as we continue to discuss this period together.
Thank you. There's one more question. I wonder if you might reflect on the everyday life of these refugees during their time in Germany.
So the everyday life depends. If you were a writer and you had a contract for American Jewish newspaper, you might be doing fairly well. The reality is that Bergelson did support himself by writing journalism, but his wife was also working as a translator between German and Russian for firms doing business with the Soviet Union. So that was really where the money came in the family. Another couple of writers who were not based primarily in Berlin, but were in Hamburg, were the writer Der Nister, Pinchas Kahanovich, and Leib Kvitko. They worked for an export house sending commodities from Germany to the Soviet Union. So that's how they made their living. Working on behalf, even indirectly, of the Soviet Union was also an important meal ticket for these intellectuals because they had linguistic resources, they were good writers, and so it further maintains their connection with what was happening in the Soviet Union. The people who don't have that luxury of being able to write and being able to publish live like the protagonist of the story I talked about. They spend their times in the cafes. They're almost beggars. They keep themselves hygienic by going to public bathhouses. They eat very bad food for very little money. It's not fun being a refugee. It's not glamorous and it's not romantic. And the bitterness, the estrangedness, the estrangement, the precarity of that is really very vividly conveyed, even though Bergelson only writes 8 stories, about Berlin. Those stories really pack the same intensity of a full-length novel.
Interesting. A few more questions. Jane Schufer asks, or she says, you mentioned Bergelson's wife worked as a translator, and asks if you're aware of women who were writing at the time, perhaps in Yiddish.
This is a really, really important question. And my very regretful answer is I do not. I do not know of any Yiddish writers who were women who spent a great deal of time in Berlin. I know of one important intellectual figure, Dvora Fogel, spent about 3 months in Berlin in 1926, but she didn't write anything in Yiddish during that time. Believe me, I looked. I do compare Bergelson in my book with a German language non-Jewish female writer, Irmgard Coin. And I talk about the ways in which the estrangement and the precarity of women's artistic endeavors in Berlin are in some ways comparable, even when they're writing in German, to the way that male Yiddish writers write about their experience. But to look for female Yiddish writers, there were female Yiddish writers who are active in Vilna, who are active in Warsaw, certainly who are active in New York and in other centers, but it's maybe a testimony to the marginality of Berlin that there were no female writers in Yiddish that I know of there. And I wish that that weren't the case.
We have a question from Yael Chaver. Hello, Yael. She says this is slightly off topic, but she asks if you know how Hebrew writers such as Shai Agnon and Ori Tzvi Greenberg supported themselves while in Berlin.
This is a really good question because the case of Agnon in particular is a very glaring contrast to the Yiddish writers. Agnon was very popular among German Jewish readers in German translation. And he actually had a kind of a patron, Zalman Schaken, who created the Schaken book publishers, really subsidized Agnon's career for the 12 years that he lived in Germany. He had great intellectual cachet. It was in Germany that he met Gershom Scholem. Through Gershom Scholem, he met Walter Benjamin, the cultural critic. Scholem and Benjamin attended a Passover Seder at Agnon's house. This is the meal in history I most would have liked to have attended. So his presence in Berlin was very different from the Yiddish writers, and part of the reason why is because Agnon, who of course is a very, very great writer, was also a very useful writer for the way that German Zionists imagine themselves and imagine the culture that they sought to recreate. Agnon had a kind of he had the allure or the mystique of authenticity that these Yiddish writers who are writing about socialism and writing about refugees, and they're writing about the city, and they're writing about really fantastic, violent, depressing stories, they're not as useful for the German community. So this is one way in which the Hebrew writers fared very differently in the eyes of their German Jewish interactors. Another point that's very important is that the Hebrew literature that was published in Berlin in the 1920s was really created for export to Palestine as opposed to Poland or the United States. So this is another big difference between those writers.
Great. The Passover Seder you mentioned is a good segue to a question from Michal G, who asks what the relationship to religion these writers had, or if they had any connection to the religious community in Berlin.
So as far as I know, these writers saw themselves as secular. Now, for me, secular and Yiddish is always a contradiction in terms. And it's very interesting that despite the fact that they're enamored of communism, they identify as socialists, they have sympathies with Zionism, they do not have interest, they smoke on Shabbos, they don't fast on Tisha B'Av. There's a lot of things that they're not doing in terms of religious life. Their writing is invested in a rhetoric of religious experience that you can't really understand unless you know the sources they're drawing from. So unless you know the Hasidic story, you can't make head or tails of what Dan Ister is trying to do. David Bergelson offers the most vivid example of this, in my opinion. His major novel that he wrote in the 1920s, and it's a novel that was serialized in the Polish press and in the American press. It debuted simultaneously in Vilna and the Soviet Union, is about the way that a shtetl becomes Sovietized. What happens when the Soviet commissar shows up in the shtetl? The name of the novel is Midas Hadin. This is a Hebrew term that refers to the strict judgment of God. Midas Hadin is a Kabbalistic concept that's applied to Rosh Hashanah. That on Rosh Hashanah, our souls are judged for the sins that we've committed, and on Yom Kippur, the Midas Harachamim, the character of mercy within God's oneness, forgives us. Calling the novel Midas Hadin draws on a whole series of theological and cosmological concepts that only exist with an advanced knowledge of Jewish religious thought. But it's a novel about communists in the shtetl. So the religiosity is there and it isn't there at the same time.
Wow, interesting. Thank you. So I'm going to say last call for questions. I don't see any more. If you have one, please put it in the chat. I'm sorry, in the Q&A section, not in the chat. So far, I don't see anything. So perhaps that's it. Maybe someone will pop in with one as we're closing this out. I'd like to thank Mark Kaplan for this really compelling and fascinating lecture. As usual, to be honest. I'd also like to thank Carnegie Hall's Fall of the Weimar Republic Dancing on the Precipice Festival. And again, we have 2 more programs coming up as part of this festival, one in March and one in May. And I hope you'll join us for those. Yael Chaver is back with a really interesting question, and I thought of this as well. Midas Hadin, what happens to the shtetl under communism versus Moshe Kolbach Zalman, which is a different story, but similar theme. So maybe you have maybe you have something to say about that.
Yeah, so in my book, I do not talk about Zalman Yaner because that was a novel that Kolbach wrote when he was already living in the Soviet Union. It's the novel that basically got Moshe Kolbach shot. But I do talk about another Kolbach narrative. It's actually his first experiment in prose, really the most experimental work ever written in Yiddish, in my opinion, which is called Mashiach ben Ephraim, the Messiah of the house of Ephraim, or the house of Joseph. The Mashiach ben Ephraim is the Midas Hadin. And the Mashiach ben David, the Messiah of the house of David, is the Midas Harachamim, the Messiah of mercy. So Kolbach is invested in exactly the same cosmological resonances that Bergelson is. It was a time for dwelling not on redemption, but on apocalypse. And this is a theme that connects Kolbach with Bergelson, with Danister, with Joseph Roth, with all of these figures in the Weimar era. It's also something in a weird way that connects them with what's happening in German culture in films like Metropolis, for example, by Fritz Lang. These are all heavily preoccupied with the destruction of a culture because they're not quite yet able to imagine rebuilding a culture. And for Kolbach and for Bergelson, rebuilding means going back to the Soviet Union with some very, very sad consequences as a result of that.
Thank you. We have one last question, it appears, from Marcia Cohen. Was there any overlap with Bauhaus and this cadre of writers?
Right. So historically, they're all in the same place at the same time. The way in which you understand their interaction, I'm not really sure how much Bergelson knew or thought about modern design or about architecture. But I think that there is nonetheless a parallel or a connection that we as observers can make. We know about Bauhaus, and we can read Bergelson. Hopefully we can read him in Yiddish. If we can't, he's been well served by translators. We can read him in translation and we can say, oh, well, the way in which Bergelson highlights the significance of objects, of surfaces, the way in which the work that the furniture of a room performs to convey the character of the situation he's describing. Well, maybe that's similar to the kinds of aesthetic investments that Bauhaus or other architects or other designers of that era were also doing. This is a point that I try to elaborate on further in the book, but it's a subtle point because I don't know of any direct connections between them.
Right. All right. I think we're about out of time. Please join me again in thanking Dr. Kaplan for quite a compelling lecture. And please check YIVO's schedule for upcoming lectures that we have. We have them quite frequently. So I think as an audience, you might enjoy them. Okay, that's it. Thank you again, and enjoy the rest of your day.